In the quiet town of Circleville, Ohio, nestled amidst the serene landscapes of the American heartland, a sinister secret lay hidden beneath the surface, a mystery so chilling that it would haunt the community for decades. It began with a whisper, a seemingly innocuous letter that arrived one fateful day in the late 1970s. But as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into years, these letters would transform into a relentless storm of terror, shaking the town to its core. Imagine living in a place where your every move is observed, where your deepest secrets are laid bare, and your worst fears materialize in handwritten notes delivered to your doorstep. This is the twisted reality that the unsuspecting residents of Circleville found themselves trapped within, a real-life nightmare that defies explanation. It all began when a school bus driver, Mary Gillespie, received a threatening letter from an unknown sender, who became known as the Circleville Writer. The letter intimated that Mary was having an affair with the local school superintendent, Gordon Massey, and that she or her daughter could soon face dire consequences. Mary kept quiet until her husband, Ron Gillespie, received a similar missive a few days later. Soon, chatter began to spread around the town as other residents, government officials, and the local newspaper began receiving their own handwritten messages admonishing them to expose Gordon Massey and punish him for his alleged misdeeds. For a small, quiet, quintessentially American town whose main attraction is its annual pumpkin show, the Circleville Letters would prove to have devastating repercussions. Most of the envelopes had postmarks stamped in nearby Columbus, Ohio, but the writers seemed to know intimate details about the lives of folks all over town. Still, Mary and Ron seemed to be the writers' primary targets. And as the months passed, Ron would spend hours taking down hateful signs that would pop up along Mary's bus route. As the harassment continued, the Gillespies found that they had no other choice but to take matters to the Circleville sheriff. Despite dispatching a team of officers to investigate the case, phone taps and surveillance of the mail and local neighborhoods, Mary and Ron continued to receive terrifying messages. Things came to a head in August 1977. Ron believed that he knew the identity of the Circleville writer and had decided to put a stop to the matter of the letters once and for all. Mary decided to go to Florida with her sister-in-law and left the children at home with Ron. That evening, August 19th, Ron got a phone call from the alleged writer that spurred him to take action. He picked up his .22 caliber revolver and drove away in his pickup truck in pursuit of the writer. Whether they met is unknown. Ron Gillespie met his destiny when he crashed into a tree and died, aged 35. After finding Ron's gun under his body, investigators examined the weapon and came to believe that he had fired one shot from his gun before his truck hit the tree. The sheriff, Dwight Radcliffe, questioned at least one suspect but pressed no charges. Ron's death was ruled to be an accident related to drunk driving. His blood level had been measured at twice the legal limit. This ruling surprised many of Ron's family and friends, who didn't see him as a heavy drinker. Rather than putting an end to the mystery, Ron's death only raised more questions and heightened the Circleville writer's malice. The writer resumed his attacks on Mary Gillespie and Gordon Massey and sent new letters to local businesses, schools, and area residents, saying that Sheriff Radcliffe was covering up the truth about the incident, even though the coroner had ruled the death was accidental. In fact, a suspect had been brought to the station only to be released when they passed a polygraph examination. The threats against Mary became more intense and continued for years. One February afternoon in 1983, Mary Gillespie was on her way to pick up her kids, who were just getting out of school. She approached 5 Points Pike. She saw an obscene sign on a fence that said nasty things about her 13-year-old daughter. She stopped the bus, got out, and pulled the sign off the fence. That's when she noticed some twine and a box were attached to the sign. When Mary got home, she opened the box and discovered a pistol that was rigged to go off. Mary just had a brush with death. The police found that someone had haphazardly filed off part of the gun's serial number when they examined the booby trap. After reconstructing this information, the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation traced the gun to Paul Freshour, Ron's brother-in-law. Police set out to question Paul and his wife, Karen Sue. They learned that in the late 1970s, before Ron's accident, Paul, Karen Sue, Ron, and Mary were friendly and hung out together on weekends. By the time Mary found the gun, Karen Sue and Paul had separated. The divorce proceedings were acrimonious, and Karen Sue had no interest in protecting her husband, mentioning to police that Paul became enraged when Mary hooked up with Gordon Massey after Ron's death. She had even told the police that she found a torn-up letter in a toilet and others hidden in the house, thus fingering her husband as the Circleville writer. Paul immediately became a prime suspect. Paul cooperated with the police when they arrived at his house and allowed them to search the premises. He did not ask for a lawyer and seemingly had nothing to hide. When the police asked him about the gun, he agreed it was his, but said he thought it had been stolen. When they asked about how it ended up in the box, he said, "I don't know." A little over 2 weeks later, Sheriff Radcliffe asked Paul to meet him in town and try to copy the handwriting from the letters. Paul was directed to copy the letters as they appeared, rather than using a transcribed letter as a template. Later, Paul showed Sheriff Radcliffe the place in his garage where he had kept his gun. After both men returned to the courthouse, police gave Paul a polygraph test, which he failed, and arrested him for the attempted murder of Mary Gillespie. The trial for the attempted murder of Mary Gillespie began on October 24, 1983, at the Pickaway County Courthouse in Circleville. As testimony began, Mary was questioned about the sign and the rigged gun, but the focus of the trial soon shifted to the Circleville Letters over the defense's objections. Prosecutors argued that the style of writing on the sign Mary found was the same as the handwriting in the Circleville Letters, and the judge allowed 39 letters to be submitted as evidence. Even though Paul Freshour was not on trial for writing the letters, they would prove to hurt his case when a handwriting analysis testified that he could have written the letters, and a second expert, originally a witness for the defense, concurred. Prosecutors had a hard time proving Paul rigged the gun because they could not find his fingerprints on any part of the booby trap. The day Mary found the sign, Paul had taken the day off from work at Anheuser-Busch, where he could have easily picked up the box that was used in the trap. However, these facts were circumstantial, and Paul had an alibi. Several witnesses testified that they had seen him at home while his house was being repaired. Still, courtroom testimony cast a great deal of suspicion over Paul's innocence. Although he pleaded not guilty, Paul Freshour never took the witness stand. After the jurors weighed the evidence, he was convicted of attempted murder and sentenced to 7 to 25 years in prison. When the trial was over, many residents in Circleville were more than ready to move on with their lives. They felt thankful that the Circleville writer had been caught after years of disruption. Paul Freshour was locked away in a cell and forbidden to use paper or pens. Many of Paul's family and friends were devastated by his conviction and couldn't come to terms with the idea that the man they knew as a capable manager and upstanding family man could be foolish enough to put his own gun in a trap, much less be guilty of attempted murder. Yet after everything, Circleville residents continued to receive threatening letters. Some of these messages were addressed to Paul Freshour himself, and in one, the author bragged about setting him up. Rumors spread that Karen Sue, Paul's ex-wife, was behind the letters because she hated him and stood to benefit from his conviction. However, Karen Sue lost her home and custody of their daughters during the divorce. She had moved into a trailer on Mary Gillespie's property, her life also in ruins. In the 1990s, two investigative journalists, Robin Yoakum and Martin Yant, started looking into the case. Martin Yant believed that Paul Freshour had been set up. While looking through police reports, Yant discovered evidence of a second suspect identified by one of Mary Gillespie's fellow bus drivers.
There was another bus driver who saw what I think is very significant. It was something that never came up at trial, and it points in a whole different direction.
The driver said that she had driven by the ugly sign just after 3 p.m., 20 minutes before Mary arrived. The driver said she saw a big, sandy-haired man standing beside an El Camino, but she didn't see him up close. Paul Freshour was a smaller, dark-haired man. Later, it was discovered that Karen Sue's brother owned an El Camino. Was the real criminal still at large? Martin Yant began to question the integrity of the case and wondered if Karen Sue Freshour had framed her husband.
There's no evidence that any inquiries were made about who might have an El Camino.
Despite these revelations, there was no real chain of evidence that pointed to her involvement in planting a trap or writing any threatening letters, and she was never implicated by the police. Circleville would not be free of harassment for some time. As the years passed, the Circleville writer continued to send out hundreds of letters. The prison warden claimed that Paul could not possibly have written them. He was isolated and under supervision, and all of his mail was inspected. The sheriff of Pickaway County believed Paul was responsible for the letters, but had no proof. After publishing an article about Paul Freshour, Martin Yant received his own threatening letter. The case even caught the attention of the television series Unsolved Mysteries in 1993. Soon after Paul had been released on parole, Unsolved Mysteries came to Circleville. Paul himself appeared on the show and expressed interest in finding out once and for all who wrote the Circleville Letters.
I'd really like to see someone really look at this case on the letters, reopen the letter part of it and get in and find out who wrote the letters.
He continued to profess his innocence and shared his pain about how the ordeal had hurt his family. Paul had a fraught relationship with his daughters, and he was estranged from his son. Many people in town continued to believe that he was responsible for keeping Circleville residents on edge for years. When Robin Yoakum interviewed Paul Freshour, he said, "I didn't write the letters. I didn't do this." Paul also had approached the FBI about looking into the matter, but the FBI never responded. And in another twist, once Paul was released from prison, the Circleville writer stopped sending out letters altogether. After his incarceration was over, Paul Freshour tried to resume a normal life, but the damage to his family lingered. On September 11, 2002, the body of 39-year-old Mark Freshour, Paul's son, was found in the Scioto River near Portsmouth, Ohio. Mark had shot himself, and Karen Sue Freshour told police that her son had suffered from depression for years. Some residents even believed that Mark had been responsible for taking Paul's gun all along. Perhaps he had set the trap for Mary Gillespie and finally succumbed to the guilt. Martin Yant and Robin Yoakum came to believe that the evidence against Paul Freshour was flimsy, although neither journalist was entirely convinced of his innocence. The case was fading into the background, but it still held plenty of mystery. Nearly 3 decades after Paul Freshour's conviction, Mary Ellen O'Toole, a former FBI profiler, agreed to try to provide insight into the identity of the Circleville writer for the television program 48 Hours. After reviewing the Circleville Letters, she said she believed that a single author was responsible for their contents. Mary Ellen O'Toole characterized that author as an expert manipulator who cleverly disguised their identity to avoid suspicion.
Gender is very difficult to discern.
She claimed that whoever the writer is, they're flying under the radar screen, coming across as very normal, and people would not suspect them. After inspecting 98 letters, Mary Ellen O'Toole speculated that the Circleville writer was poorly educated because many sentences were badly written. She also believed that the Circleville writer was really having a good time and could have deliberately chosen to bully and harm people outside of their everyday lives. This summation contrasted with an assessment of Paul Freshour's persona. Paul had a master's degree and a good reputation around town and was considered by many to be mild-mannered, leading the profiler to express doubt about Paul's guilt. Despite Mary Ellen O'Toole's professional recommendation, clues remained that led other experts to believe that Paul Freshour was behind the Circleville Letters after all. 48 Hours also asked forensic document expert Beverly East to provide an independent analysis of the handwriting on their pages. Beverly East claimed to be unfamiliar with and uninterested in the case history, preferring to let the documents tell the story.
I don't want to hear the story because the documents tell me the story.
She started her assessment by looking over some letters Paul Freshour was known to have written in his own handwriting to identify distinctive characteristics of his writing patterns and compare them to the anonymously written letters. As Beverly East surveyed both sets of handwriting, she discovered similarities in the style of the letter G and many of the numbers written throughout the pages. She told 48 Hours that the G in Grimer is a very unusual G. It looks like a 6, a number 6. That's very unusual. The G in question had appeared in the words Gillespie, Gettin, and Gordon in the Circleville Letters, and one had been sent during Paul Freshour's stay in prison. Beverly East further claimed that numbers don't lie and pointed to a number 3 that could have also been a 2 in a zip code. This number appeared in several different anonymous letters. After identifying almost 100 examples of Paul Freshour's personal handwriting idiosyncrasies, she was completely convinced that he wrote the Circleville Letters himself. There was one more bit of evidence that supports Beverly East's conclusions. Marie Mayhew, creator of the podcast Whatever Remains, studied the thousands of pages of Paul Freshour's case file when she was preparing her episode on the Circleville Letters. During her research, she discovered that investigators had found Paul Freshour's fingerprints on more than 10 letters that were postmarked while he was in prison. Like Beverly East, she is also convinced that Paul Freshour is the Circleville writer. Mary Ellen O'Toole remains doubtful, given that hundreds of letters were mailed while Paul was in prison. On June 28, 2012, Paul Freshour died at the age of 70. To the end of his life, he proclaimed his innocence, and no one knows for sure if the image of the decent man he appeared to be masked the broken soul of a disturbed criminal. Paul Freshour even predicted that his reputation would outlive him when he was dead and gone. But now the case is closed, and no one will ever know.